Rio de Janeiro with a big man.
Hey everyone, my name is Abid Imam and welcome to Rio de Janeiro. I'm super stoked because we're going to be speaking to a world champion, Olympic gold medalist, and a person who has one of the most important jobs in world sport. Her name is Mary Harvey. She was a goalkeeper for the US women's national team at the first ever FIFA Women's World Cup in 1991. The US went on to win that tournament, and Mary was part of the team that won the Olympic gold medal at Atlanta 1996, on her home soil as well. After that, Mary went on to huge roles at FIFA and then the CEO for the US Women's Professional Soccer League. Now she's the CEO for the Center of Sport and Human Rights. It's an absolutely huge responsibility working through global issues that had massive implications. Through having Craig Foster on the show, I started to take a bit more interest in the global side of things with sport and human rights, and my research led me to Mary and the work that she's doing at the centre. I was really thankful that she could join me on the show. Thanks to Matt Stone from the centre for helping out as well. It was so great to be able to learn from someone of her calibre, and I think sport and human rights have a safe pair of hands with her at the helm. As always, the show notes can be found on the website, abidimam.com. This site was made with love from the show sponsor, SiteBeat. Their website builder is so simple that even I could use it. For those who are a little bit more fancy, they have e-commerce capabilities and heaps of add-ons if you're looking to turbocharge your business. So I definitely recommend checking them out. Let's hop to it. Please enjoy this discussion with Mary Harvey. So Mary, thank you so much for joining me on Rio de Janeiro. As an Olympic gold medalist, a FIFA World Cup champion, and also the Centre of Sport and Human Rights CEO, it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you.
Thanks for having me on, Abid. This is great.
Yeah, and I love that you're on the west coast of America and I'm on the west coast of Australia. So we're about 11 hours apart, but that's our commonality there.
Yeah. Glad to hear. It's getting a little late for you, so hopefully this isn't too painful.
No problems. Well, I'd love to start by talking and maybe rewinding back to your first football experiences and maybe even broadly in sport as well. How do you reflect on those?
Well, I, as you can tell by my accent, I'm from North America, specifically the United States. And so football has a different place, for me growing up. It was very much a participatory kids sport. It's sort of your first introduction to organized sport was football or soccer, as we call it. So I joined a local grassroots league, I think when I was 12, which is very late, by today's standards, right? People are playing it, they have 4-year-olds running around. So I was very late, but I was athletic. And so it was really my first chance to go from sort of school ground, recess sort of sport to organized sport. And I loved it. I was good at it because I had a physical literacy. I was coordinated and athletic. So I loved it. And I sort of realized that it's really where I fit in.
What was the grassroots football system like in America at those times? Because I hear a lot about the impressive numbers, the popularity of the game, and give us an insight into that if possible.
Sure. Well, back then it was a local organization in my hometown, Los Altos, which is a little now it's famous for venture capitalists live there, but at the time it was very different. So this is, I'm going to age myself, the mid 70s to late 70s. And it was, a participatory league called AYSO. That's the organization. They emphasize participation, not performance. And it was just a really wonderful way to have a first introduction to the sport. So, the issues of parents being aggressive and, things at stake wasn't there. It was just sort of very pure, do you like playing? Great. It was all girls. There was enough kids, girls playing that we could have all girls teams. So I didn't play on mixed teams. I played on girls teams. And it was very, there at the time there was zero awareness of professional football. We didn't have it on television. We didn't have it in the United States. Well, actually the NASL I think was dying at that point so there was a little bit, but it wasn't aware of it. So it just was this very sort of, oh, this is a nice sport. Which isn't what the rest of the world sees, right? It's like everything.
Well, you moved to a footballing country, which was Germany. What was it like playing football overseas, and maybe some of those challenges that you experienced as well?
Oh my God. I mean, going from the United States in like 1989, 88, 89 to Germany was actually, I was going to stop playing football because I'm 21, 22 years old. I'm done with university. I got to go to work. There's no place for me to play. There's no opportunity. So time to put my degree to use and go to work. And work sent me to Germany. I worked for a company that's now called Accenture. At the time it was called Anderson Consulting. And so I end up working on a project in Frankfurt. And if you can imagine, and maybe, I don't know if some of this translates at all, but coming from a country where it just wasn't, you had to look for it to find football, to go to a country where it is everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It's in the newspaper, it's on television. I mean, it's just, you're a junkie, you just drink it up. It was amazing. And this was the year before. I mean, think about what's happening in Germany in 1989. The wall comes down, small thing, right? That's all happening. And Germany's about to go to the 1990 World Cup in Italy, where they win.
Yeah.
Right? So incredible time to be over there.
Wow. That resonates with me so much when you say coming from a country where football is not really number one, and you sort of feel like you're in this underground sort of culture. World Cups over here in Australia would be at 3 a.m, 4 a.m. And I remember going to my first, or one of my first World Cups, which was in Brazil, and just being in this country that just lives and breathes it. It gives you goosebumps thinking about it. So I can imagine what you went through. So you became a professional in Germany as well. So tell us about that, your contract and who you're playing for and playing professionally.
Well, I'll be transparent about what professional meant. Professional meant how I conducted myself. But technically speaking, I was on an amateur contract.
Right.
I mean, this is 89, 90, 91, 92. Women's football, there weren't any professional contracts, I don't think, in the world that had a football contract that had a professional player and that player being female at the same time. I don't think those actually existed, nor do I think the player transfer system could process it. You didn't have leagues that were professional. You didn't have football associations that incorporated professional leagues for women. Like, none of it existed. So I was on an amateur contract, and I was working full-time for Accenture. And that, you're working 80-hour work weeks, and I'm playing. So you asked about challenges. One of the challenges was, you're playing 150 games a year, you're training, 4 times a week, playing 1 to 1.5 games a week, depending on if you're on cup games or not. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of room for anything else. So it wasn't really professional, but I would say it was premier. So it was a total dedication to it. You trained once a day. They didn't have things like later on in my career when I was a full-time professional player, where there's, you have a lot more time. You have access to nutritionists, you have access to strength coaches, you have access to weight room, none of that was happening. But the football was incredible.
You look at European football these days, and the clubs are very cosmopolitan in the dressing rooms. What was it like in your dressing room back then? Were you a bit of a novelty, or was there a bit of diversity too?
I was a bit of a freak show, right? I mean, that's not terribly complimentary, but I mean, I come in, this is, I walk on basically. I mean, there's no U.S. women's national team. I mean, I wasn't on the U.S. women's national team. We hadn't played internationally. Nobody knew if we were any good or not. The Germans are like 3-time European champions. They just won the European championship. And I show up and they're like, well, you look like you're okay. Like, how come you're so good? Like, you're an American. Do they play over there? You know, I have to go through all that. And that's fine. But one of the gifts is that not a lot of my teammates spoke English back then. Now it's different, but back then not a lot of teammates spoke English. So I was in an immersion situation to learn German, and as a result, even though it was painful, I learned to speak German.
Especially as a goalkeeper, because you're communicating with your back four, your defensive line. Definitely.
And that was probably the single biggest challenge, was coming also from a culture where we communicate a lot, to a lot of other, places, a lot of different nationalities I've played with. They don't talk as much on the field. They'll whistle, they'll clap, they'll do whatever, but they don't. And we're very verbal. And so sort of having that taken away from you as a goalkeeper made adjustment really, really difficult.
So now you're starting to play for the US women's national team, the iconic, amazing team. What was it like, and what were the conditions like around that national team during the time of your debut?
Wow. When I go around the world and I talk to like national team players, I've been in Jordan, I've talked to national teams in Qatar and in different parts, and they say, well, thank you for talking about the U.S. women's team, but you have no idea what it's like here, right? That's very nice for you to talk about. These are rock stars, these are professional players, these players are larger than life. You don't understand what it's like here. And I say, oh, but I do. Oh, but I do. It was incredibly humble beginnings. We're wearing hand-me-down uniforms the U.S. Soccer Federation wasn't a wealthy organization. We didn't have a professional league. We hadn't qualified for the World Cup. There just wasn't a lot of money. And then, so the women's national team was very much a shoestring budget. So it wasn't anything like what it is now. I mean, not even close. But there were similarities in culture. And the similarities were, how do we make things better? Given wherever we are, in this case, the very beginning, how do we make things better for those that come after us? And that has been something, and collective voice in doing so. And that's been something that the team has retained over the decades that it's been in existence.
One of the key drivers of that is that first ever FIFA Women's World Cup victory in 1991 in China. The Dare to Dream documentary, for the listener, definitely recommend it. It's a fantastic look into that team and how you have built this, the foundations of this awesome culture that comes through the US women's national team you see now. Can you take us through being in China at that time? One of the really interesting insights of that documentary, seeing the reception you had from the Chinese fans and the massive crowds you were playing in front of. The fact it was called the M&M Cup, it's all a bit surreal, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it was a different time, right? I mean, it was just, this was a first for them. They were having a Women's World Cup for the first time. I mean, they'd had a trial one several years before to sort of test it out. And the countries that you would imagine would be advanced when it came to women's sports were countries that advanced women in general. So the Nordic countries, Australia was there, other countries. But it was a first for FIFA. So it wasn't incredibly well resourced. At the time, M&M Mars, I believe, was a FIFA sponsor. And so they gave them naming rights to the Women's World Cup, which of course isn't done anymore. But it also reflected the time, right? The reflections of the tournament, it was incredibly well received. I mean, we played in front of big crowds. We'd never done that before, but they were very polite, so they sort of, in spite the fact that there's 60,000 people in the stands, you could talk to each other on the field, right? It's not like playing in a premiership where you have 60,000 people and you can't talk to each other because you can't hear anything. So there wasn't a lot of crowd noise while you're playing, which was very strange, but it was, and talk about different. We played 80-minute games.
Oh, okay. I
Because
didn't know
it's a bit
that.
like the women's marathon, right? It's like, well, women can't play the marathon.
Oh,
They're not fit. So we played 80-minute games. I'm telling you, that really paid off in the final because I don't think we could have lasted another 10 minutes.
mm.
Um, and we played 3 games in 5 days. I mean, you wouldn't at a World Cup, right? You would, but if you, I mean, that didn't change until 1999, right? So
Wow.
the first 2 women's World Cup, we played 3 games in 5 days, and we played 80-minute games. So
Okay. Mm.
yeah.
That's intense. I remember that final, the footage they show Pele walking out and actually shaking hands with all the players when you're
Yeah.
lining up for the national anthem. um, oh, it's incredible. Moving to the Olympics, because 5 years later you become an Olympic champion on home soil. What are the differences between a FIFA World Cup that you played in and an Olympic Games as a player in football?
It's a great question. It's so different. I mean, the whole atmosphere is different. As a international football player, you're used to doing things like World Cups, the Champions League or the European Championship. You have a tournament and it's only football, and everybody gets it, and there's a rhythm to it. And even playing the Olympics, and it's totally different. I mean, you're one of everything else that's going on. And football, because of the size of it, is typically the first rounds are moved out of the right. So this was the case in 2000 when Australia hosted. Right, you had games in Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne. Right, they weren't in Sydney, at least not until the later rounds, I think. So it was the same. So it was a little bit strange, but it gave us a glimpse of what was possible because it was the first time we were playing double headers, right? So 2 games back to back. And first games, 40,000 people are there. And we're like, wow, this is pretty interesting. So Americans love the Olympics. So we were drawing big crowds. And we get to the semifinal, and there's 70,000, 80,000 people there. And, those weren't, no, they were double headers. I think we were curtain raiser before the men. I mean, it's incredible. And so that was when FIFA saw that and said 1999 is possible in big stadiums, the Women's World Cup. But winning an Olympics in front of your home crowd is just, I mean, I'll never forget it. It was an incredible, incredible night. I can vividly remember it. I mean,
what do you remember most from it?
I remember being in the tunnel. So the award ceremony, you have these 3 podiums, there's and the gold one's the tall one in the middle. And so they line you up single file in the tunnel. And so in front of us was the silver medalist, China, single file. And then behind us, because we're in the middle, gold. And then behind us were the Norwegians, bronze. And so we're all lined up in our award suits, right? And then we see the trays of the medals go by, right? Because they have the people that are holding them, and they have like the medals and the flowers. And then you can hear this hush in the crowd, and the loudspeakers say, okay, the award ceremony is about to begin. And then they, say, médaille d'argent, l'équipe nationale de Chine, and China comes out, and there's clapping, and then we're out next, and they say, l'équipe, championnat olympique, Jeux olympiques, les États-Unis. Well, I mean, it's just sonic boom hits like this stadium. I mean, it literally was like a wall of sound just hit you coming out of the tunnel. It was incredible. I mean, yeah. I'll never forget that. It was amazing.
Was your family in the crowd?
They were. My family and parents were there, along with the parents of my teammates, partners and family. So it was great.
You've had all of these fantastic football and life experiences, and then now you transition to life after football. How were you prepared for it? And did you always know that you wanted to take this route into sport administration and to continue making an impact?
No, I didn't. But I was very much a product of my circumstance. I was never a professional football player until the last 2 years of my career, where I earned $2,000 a month to be a full-time national team player. I had always worked. So I, started off at Accenture. I worked 4 years at Accenture while I'm playing on the national team. And that took me to, Germany. And then I worked for 2 years for a financial services company in Sweden. So I'm in Sweden for 2 years. And then I go full time. So I had a career that I'd started. And then right after I'm done playing, I go to business school. So I get my MBA. And Moya Dodd, same thing, right? You sort of have this transition, law school as well. And then you pop out the other end. It is time to go back to work. But what was different is I was different. And so I went back into management consulting, but I became somebody when I went back into management consulting, this time at Deloitte, where I was given really great opportunities. I found I didn't scare. They could I was fairly young, to be doing very senior level projects, and I was doing very senior level projects. Probably because I liked the adrenaline and I didn't scare easily.
Such a goalkeeper.
Well, but and that's where you start to sort of realize what you've been given, or I started to realize what I'd been given through playing those years on the national team. I'm now starting to see it manifest itself in my work self. And that was new. And, that led me to land at FIFA at some point. And that's when I left management consulting and went into what they say industry. In this case, being an executive that oversaw the development of the sport of football from FIFA standpoint.
That's a huge role. What was it like stepping into those shoes? And now all of a sudden you've got, it must be a privilege, but then you've got this whole world of football, the biggest sport on the planet, and you're influencing it.
Yeah, it was a dream, but also, the agony and the ecstasy of it and I'll just be very candid. It was an incredible opportunity. And for me, what was the best part of it was the opportunity to implement change. At whatever pace, it was never fast enough, but having an opportunity to work change from the inside is, for me, it was attractive. So the agony of it is, you talk, especially with Black Lives Now, you talk to athletes who say, when you're on the field, everybody's equal, and you leave the field and you realize the inequalities of, yourself versus a teammate who's a different color, and you're treated a different way. And there isn't that equality. And I felt that when at FIFA, because my gender was I was reminded on a daily basis that I was American and I was a woman. And that was very different. I was the first female senior executive, at least a director of a division. There was Amber Steele was there on the marketing side. But for them, it was a big adjustment. They weren't used to having a woman as a senior executive, colleague. And I was kind of reminded of it on a daily basis. And at Deloitte or Accenture, you just sort of, you didn't have that. So that was a big adjustment for me. And I guess because of, the gender and the nationality, there's a sort of reflex reaction to discount. Well, they don't know anything about football. She's a woman. She's American. She's also an Olympic gold medalist and a FIFA world champion. So, it's sort of that, that how do you check that, right? How do you come to grips with all of that in one sort of person? And I think that was a struggle a little bit to try to figure that out.
How did you approach that in the corridors of power? How did you go about that then?
I learned a couple of things. One is sort of leaning into my personality as a former player. right? So when we talk football or, be around technicians relating to it the way a football player relates to the game, it credentializes you. Oh yeah, she is a former player. Like, yeah, she does. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, she was an Olympic, because you're walking around every day and you look like you're just going to work. You don't look like that part of you. So I would say kind of leaning into my background a little bit more than I would have if I'd been in another work context. If I was back still in management consulting, I wouldn't do that. But things like that, a bit of a reminder that, I see the game the same as, the referees or, the coaches you bring in or the ex-players you bring in.
And what perspective did it give you of global sport? Having an insight in what's going on in the Pacific region, for instance, and having that empathy with football development across the world.
That's the other part that was just incredible, was the opportunity to learn. And I love learning. I'm a lifelong learner. And that's the part that fascinated me, is what do they need to really help them make sustainable change in different parts of the world that had, in some cases, their uniqueness, but also areas where they shared challenges with other parts of the world. So where were the commonalities, the common threads, and where were their uniqueness that then we could try to build something that would really help them where they needed it. And I really loved that part of it. I loved the listening part and I loved the learning part.
While you were working at FIFA, there was some developments in US women's football with the league, and there became an opportunity for you to actually make the move to help the development and establishment of US women's league. So it must have been challenging to leave FIFA, but there was a new mission for you. So take us through helping to start that new league in the US.
Yeah, so I made the decision to leave FIFA was actually separate. So I didn't leave FIFA to take it. I left FIFA. There was a new general secretary. Jerome Balt came in, and it was time to, it was a good time to sort of say, okay, I've done what I think I can do here, and look for what's next. And I'd been overseas at that point. Third country, 12 years, parents are getting older. I'm thinking it's maybe time I come home. And so WUSA was the first pro league, had folded, and it had been 8 years. And they were looking for a chief operating officer. And I knew the commissioner from when we were players at university. So I agreed to come on board and help start the league up, which I did. So it was again a tremendous opportunity to learn about player transfer rules. And when I talked about before about professional players and being female, we're now processing 300 professional player contracts, including players from Germany and Sweden and Brazil, and realizing that it is impossible at the time in 2008 to process a professional contract and do a loan of a professional player to Germany because they can't process a female professional player according to their statutes.
Oh, geez.
They couldn't do it, right? So you couldn't do the transfer. It's like they're a professional player. You're trying to give them a loan. You can't loan them. They have to actually stop end their professional contract and go back to being an amateur. I mean, it was crazy. So just learning about all of those challenges was interesting, and it was an opportunity to try to improve things.
We then moved to the Center of Sport and Human Rights, which is your current role. It is a fascinating organization and much needed. When you just reflect on human rights and sport and that intersection, it's so broad. So I really look forward to speaking about those challenges with you. But how did the idea of the CSHR form and your involvement with it?
Well, how it formed predates my involvement with the organization, but the folklore of it, it's based in fact, In 2015, Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, former President of Ireland, current chair of the Elders, took over from Kofi Annan when he passed, and John Ruggie wrote a letter to Sepp Blatter saying, when are you going to do something about human rights? And this was after, there were reports about slave labor and worker injuries and deaths in Russia. It was, after the 2014 World Cup and all the problems in Brazil. And we're going into the Olympic Games in, Rio. You have problems with the Russian World Cup and stadiums. You have Qatar and issues that are coming up now about worker conditions, the kafala system, worker deaths, working in heat exhaustion, all those things. And so this prompts when is something going to be done about human rights? And I think it's 2014 or 2015. And so Blatter commissions John Ruggie to write the Ruggie Report. John Ruggie is the author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the gold standard. So which is a serious person. So to Blatter's credit, he brings in, the person who really is best suited to do this work and asks them to say, okay, how would you bring in and bring human rights into FIFA, the World Cup, and FIFA as an organization? And he writes the Ruggie Report. And the Ruggie Report is this incredible. If you ask about anything I would refer, there are a couple business things, but if you're interested in sport and human rights, absolutely read the Ruggie Report.
100% going to get onto it.
Oh, yeah, you have to read the Ruggie Report. Ruggie Report's amazing. It's really well done. Anyway, but getting back to the start of the center, right? You have this sort of growing awareness of the need for human rights. And then FIFA blows up, right? So FIFA blows up May of 2015, all this turmoil. And around the same time, in Glion, a nucleus of organizations, Mary Robinson, and, the IOC, FIFA, sponsors, people representing workers, so people representing governments, the sort of ecosystem, representatives from the ecosystem of sport, convened in Glion to have a discussion around human rights in sport, and what's needed. And that meeting was the nucleus of what would become the Center for Sport and Human Rights. So over time, that developed into a series of white papers about different topics, like how do you embed human rights and prevent human rights harms from happening at a mega sporting event? Mm-hmm. How do you do broadcaster due diligence, right? If you're a broadcaster trying to manage risk in a variety of different ways. If you're a sponsor, how do you mitigate risk in supply chains for a mega sporting event, right? So all these things were happening, these white papers, and they were being written in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So let's take mega sporting events, right? Yep. Mega sporting events, you have David Rutherford, David Grevenberg, I'm getting them wrong. The governance of sports bodies is David Rutherford and David Grevenberg. But on the MSC life cycle, mega sporting event life cycle, you had the IOC, you had FIFA, you had, the ITUC, you had many organizations with their fingerprints on it. That's what makes it different. Is it's this multi-stakeholder approach to common guide on embedding human rights into sports.
Why did or does sport have the thought that human rights is not our problem?
Well, that's myopic. That's myopic. Human rights are human rights, period. And this idea that sport is universally good is also myopic. It's a little naive, I would say. Mm-hmm. I can speak only for myself. My personal experience has been incredible through sport. It has actualized in me everything that sport, for human development, right? Leadership development, empathy, compassion, ability to work with others, all those things. But look at my experience. It was positive. Not well-resourced, but positive, right? I wasn't a Larry Nassar victim. So I wasn't a victim when I was 14 of the president of my federation saying, if you want to get out of Haiti, you have to, sleep with me. I didn't experience that. So to say that sport is universally good, or sport or human rights aren't our issue, human rights are always an issue. And you have human rights by virtue of the fact that you live and breathe. So human rights is everywhere. It's not one sector's, it's not unique or applies or doesn't apply to any one sector. It is. And sport is no different.
What have been the challenges in developing the CSHR and maintaining that independence? Because I see your advisory council and some massive organizations are coming on board and are working with you. I also think about how you work with countries as well now and maintaining those stakeholder relations, but also at the same time doing the work you need to do.
Well, it's a great question. And what the advisory council shares to an organization, what they share in common is a belief in human rights and a belief in the sporting chance principles, which is our North Star. And so you have big companies, right? Like Visa or Coca-Cola or Intel or Procter & Gamble. And typically the people, these are big places, right? Just like government's a big place. But those from those entities that work with the center and represent themselves at the center are from the human rights side of things. So the people at Coca-Cola who look at workplace, rights and conditions, the people at Visa who are concerned with social responsibility and sustainability, the people at, governments who are responsible for the human rights part of the government. And typically those are people who work in the foreign service, because that's typically where it lies.
Yeah.
And Australia is the same thing. So they are very engaged, in terms of the work of the center and their commitment to human rights, without question.
There's countries in the world, of course, where there's human rights abuses and in sport as well. How do you manage trying to work with those countries where the help and the assistance is probably most required, but it's hardest to actually get in and to do the work you need to do?
Well, that's a really good question. It doesn't, let's look at Qatar, right? Qatar won the World Cup run the right to host the World Cup back in 2010. And it was a commitment to a vision of what Qatar could become. And I talked to Hassan Al-Thawadi about this because he and I share that. We both worked on bid teams, right? And I worked on the United 2026 bid team. And he said it was about what we wanted to become. And so where that has taken them over 10 years, 12 years is labor reform. It's new laws being passed. It's, there's still, progress to be made, but think about that commitment to change and commitment to acknowledging where change could be made or needs to be made. That's different than, bidding for an event and sort of, well, we don't have human rights problems here. Or we don't talk about human rights. Beijing 2022.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're working with, and this was the approach that, as part of the bid team for 2026, which I did before I came to the center, it was acknowledging what your human rights risks are and owning them and saying, you know what? Yeah, there are a lot of guns in the country. Or, at the time there was a Muslim ban, and here are our challenges. Here's the process that we're going to outline for how we, over the next 8 years, plan to work through those and mitigate those risks. That's the difference. And having that be a public document, so you can't put it in a drawer, that's the difference, right? It's a commitment to saying we acknowledge, compared to international, human rights standards, there are gaps. Here's what we're prepared to do about them. And it's public, so the court of public opinion and others can hold us accountable. that's the difference, I think.
I need to applaud the work you've done on the United 2026 bid. For the listener, it's the USA, Mexico, Canada that will be hosting that FIFA Men's World Cup. And I'd like to talk about that pushback a little bit. You said there was a Muslim ban. There's been a challenging time in politics in America. Did you get any pushback working on something like that piece of work during that time?
Well, it's easy to go to politics. I'm going to take politics and park it for a minute. When I went to work for the bid, I thought I was going to work on environmental sustainability, which is another passion of mine, right? Environmental protection. And I'm working alongside some incredible people who are big sporting event veterans. They were involved in the 2022 bid back when it was, that was won by Qatar. They were involved in World Cup 1994. They were involved in World Cup 1999. A lot of people who have big mega sporting event FIFA experience, right? And those are the people that are working logically at the bid.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to come in. And so now they say, well, we know we wanted you to work on this part of it, but what we really need is someone to look at these human rights requirements because they're new. Nobody knows what they're going to look like. Nobody understands them. Nobody knows it. It's all new. So when I got these and I looked at them and I looked at in the backdrop of then the current political environment, I said, okay, the former player part of me says, how do I convince people who are thinking about, we're going to talk about stadiums and field sizes and hospitality and fan zones and enthusiasm and 3 countries working together and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yes, I'm all in. But we have to talk about human rights. And we don't want to talk about human rights. I'm like, I know, but we have to. Well, we don't have human rights problems here. I said, well, if you're a straight white guy, you probably don't have human rights challenges. But if you're not straight, not white, and not a guy, you're going to, that's privilege, right? So it was this process of convincing internally why it was important to acknowledge what our risks were. That was the single biggest challenge. And why it was important to be humble and very just own it, own what the challenges are. And part of it was, do you want to win? You're asking the voters to give Donald Trump, among other countries, but let's just be real about Donald Trump, the World Cup, the crown jewel. So let's think about the optics of that. And what can we give them that says, hey, we get it? And that was part of it, was the human rights strategy.
Well, I really hope that World Cup will set a new benchmark in that space and more. So an area I really wanted to, a bit of terrain I wanted to cover with you was sports washing and how someone in the public can discern from sports washing to a genuine attempt by a country to improve outlooks in a specific area. Yeah.
So we look at this a lot at the center, and it gets down to what I was talking about before when it comes to, so first of all, there are 2 ways to look at this or 2 parts to this. One is what's the expectation that's set? So if you're going to award the World Cup or the Olympic Games or the Euro or rugby, the Rugby World Cup, whatever you're doing to award these events, what's the expectation in terms of human rights protections, right? Are governing bodies of sport articulating very clearly what those look like and what they mean? That's the first side of it. That's the first part of the equation, the bidding requirements and expectations. The second part of it is, how do you respond to that? Right? So if you have them, Euro 2024 had human rights requirements. United 2026 had human rights requirements. How do you respond to them? Is it a box ticking exercise, or are you taking it seriously and you're really doing a risk assessment? You're engaging with stakeholders who are going to tell you things you maybe don't want to hear or are uncomfortable hearing. You're going to hear about what it's like to cross the border from Mexico into the United States if you're not, an American citizen or white. You're going to hear all sorts of things. But do you take it seriously, or do you just sort of mail it in and make a box picking exercise? So that's the second part of it, right? Is how does the actors on the other side, and then let's say there aren't human rights requirements. So that's Qatar 2022. That's Beijing 2022, right? How do then the organizers respond to questions or concerns raised by civil society and others around human rights? FIFA said, UN guiding principles. We're going to engage with the Supreme Committee and others around our concerns. And the Supreme Committee responds, and you have this, and now you have an ILO office in Qatar. You have labor law changes. You have a lot of things happening. Beijing, I don't know if there's been I assume there's been engagement, but is there that same, it starts with, can you say the words human rights? Or do you talk about sustainability? Right? Okay, so we'll talk about sustainability. We get that. Yeah. But is there a commitment to engage and address? And that, for me, is the difference between sports washing and having a sporting event where really there's commitment to say, we get it, here's what we're prepared to do. And in doing that, we're going to have transparency, and we're going to engage civil society in the process. That's the difference.
I'm really conscious of your time, Mary. So a few more questions. I'm sure working in global sport right now, there must be issues that come across your desk that are really difficult to grapple with. How do you work through those and come to a consensus and work with stakeholders when it's really, really complicated?
That's the part that I think is the most one of the most fascinating parts of this job is, and the UN guiding principles talk about leverage, right? Where is their leverage? So, and there isn't an easy problem, I think, that we're looking at, transgendered sport, athlete abuse, athlete activism, and athlete voice, freedom of expression, remedy. What does remedy look like in the world of sport? I mean, tough problems. And I think there isn't really necessarily the same answer to each one of those or approach to each one of those challenges. Each one looks perhaps a little bit different. But that's what's fascinating about it, is trying to figure out, where is the opportunity here? Where is there room to maneuver here? Where is there an opportunity collectively to bring change to bear on a certain challenged sport? And that's the part where collective action is at the heart of it. It always involves either a subset of actors or all actors that are involved in the advisory council, who are also involved, key players in the ecosystem of sport. Mm-hmm. They can be sponsors, they can be broadcasters, they can be governments, they can be civil society, they can be sports bodies, they can be trade unions, right? All of them. And that's the part that I think is the most rewarding and the most interesting part of it. Because it's a problem. It's a problem that you have to figure out, pick apart and figure out.
One of those that you did mention is trans and gender diverse inclusion in sport. And I just reflect on being in Rio 2016. I was really lucky to be there for the track and field and to see, I was sitting pretty close to the finish line when Kasta Semenya completed a 100-meter or 800-meter run and won the gold medal. And one of the best things about the Olympic Games and being at the track and field especially is the camaraderie between the athletes straight after a race and the hugs and the congratulations they give each other. But Kasta was casted aside. She was ignored by all of her competitors, and it just didn't sit well with me. So it's been an interesting area that I'm even working through in community sport, and I wonder how you reflect on trans and gender diverse inclusion in sport right now.
It's an intense area. It's a complicated area, and there's a lot of people working on it, I will say. And it's not easy, right? What's and so we're actually looking at this. We're going to be doing a webinar dedicated to transgender and looking at this. And I don't know what the answer looks like yet myself. But whatever the answer is, it will be rooted in human rights. It'll be rooted in human rights norms, standards, and be very, not the science, but the human rights part of it. And we'll see. My approach will be to get a lot of really smart people in the room and understand, how do we look at this, not from two sides that are dug in, throwing, fire at each other, oftentimes on social media. How can we have a safe discussion around what's the human rights part of this? Science aside, what's the human rights part of this?
Thank you.
And that's what we want to tee up.
What are your visions for the future of sport globally, and how do we get there together?
Vision for sport is fundamentally that sport is what we know it to be, which is inherently good and positive for development of, human potential globally. But it isn't that alone. It only is that when you have in the presence of safeguards that ensure that sport delivers on that. And that's through work to safeguard children, vulnerable adults. That's the work to ensure that sports does no harm. And when we've done that work, then all of those other things that sports can deliver on will be fulfilled. And that's the beautiful part of it.
You mentioned the Ruggie Report. I also want to know if there's any other reading that you'd recommend. Is there any books that you like to give as a gift or have inspired you?
I would say, one of my favorite just novels has always been To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. It's classic because it really grounds us in the reality of what it's like to walk in other people's shoes and the reality that we face, and privilege, the role of privilege. So that made a big impression on me when I was young. In terms of business books that I like, Good to Great is a classic, Jim Collins. And then also my favorite that I loved from business school was Growing Pains by Flamholtz and Randall. And it's terrific. It's about how to grow companies, and it's not falling into that abyss from one, growth stage to the next one, is being able to successfully navigate those challenges. So those are two that I definitely recommend.
Well, I hope you can successfully navigate all of the challenges and have many successes in your role, which is so important for world sport and even bigger than that. So, Mary, thank you for joining me on Rio de Janeiro. It's been fantastic and look forward to staying in touch.
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me on.
No worries.
I really enjoyed it.
Well, how good was that, hey? Mary Harvey, an amazing person with an incredible story. As always, the goodies and the show notes will be on abidimam.com. Thanks very much to Sitebeat for setting up that website. And until next time, keep smiling, keep scoring.